Namaste and welcome. I'd like to start this first class of the new year with a story that I've always loved, and it's about a diamond thief who was an absolute fabulous pickpocket. And what he'd do is he'd hang around the diamond district, and when somebody would come and buy a diamond, he'd just follow them and always manage to get it from them. So a very a wealthy, well-known diamond merchant came to town, and this guy said, he's my target. And he bought the most beautiful diamond imaginable. And so the thief followed him, and he boarded a train and took a 3-day journey, and he kept trying to pick the merchant's pocket and obtain the diamond, but by the end of the journey, he hadn't found the gem. So he was really frustrated because he was an accomplished thief. He had some pride in himself. So he actually confronted the guy, and he confessed. He said, look, I've used every skill of my art. How did you hide it from me? Where did you put it? And so the merchant said, well, I saw you, and I suspected what was happening, so I hid the diamond in the place you'd most likely look to find it. I hid it in your own pocket, So the teaching is an obvious one, which is that the treasure we seek is closer than we can imagine. The treasure we seek, what we're all longing for, is not in the future, it's not down the road, it's not outside of us. It's in the awareness and heart that's right here. And perhaps one of the best understandings of the spiritual path is that it's forgetting and remembering. That every one of it, doesn't matter how long we've practiced and been on the path, we all kind of go into trance. We forget that's true. And we get into kind of our habitual activities. And then there's a remembering, like, oh, pause, it's here. So one of the ways of thinking about it is that we're out trying to chase after the diamond and have to keep remembering it's inside. And Thoreau put it this way. He said, you spend your life fishing only to realize it's not fish that you're after, So how do we do it? We look at any day and we can see how much time we're planning things and worrying about things and trying to check things off the list. And it's so easy in our preoccupation to go through really long swaths of time and forget that what matters to us is feeling connected, feeling at home, feeling a sense of gratitude, being alive. There's a cartoon I like, and it's a graveyard, and there's the thought bubble that's coming out of the grave, and the thought bubble is saying, I think I know what I want to do with my life. And the caption underneath is, Ed pushes the late bloomer envelope to surprising new limits. So remembering what matters. And I think of it like all of the practices we do, whatever path we're on, all the rituals and ceremonies, are always about remembering. They're always about re-waking us up out of trance so we remember what we cherish, so we get more aligned with our hearts. So tonight we're going to be exploring what are called the 3 refuges. It's also known as the triple gem, which are, in the Buddhist tradition, the 3 pathways of remembering that are really kind of at the heart of the path. And interestingly, you'll find these same 3 pathways in many religions, in many spiritual paths. And that's because they're archetypal. And you'll see what I mean by that in a bit. But each of these refuges or pathways has the power to wake us up from our narrative, our story about who we are, that has that kind of limited sense of a self who's separate and usually deficient, and wake us up into a much more vast sense of the awareness and love that's here, each one of them. So the 3 gateways. The first one is called refuge in the Buddha, in Buddhism, and what it means is refuge in pure, formless, timeless awareness. The second refuge is refuge in the Dharma, and that means refuge in truth, in what's actually happening, this reality of moment-to-moment experience. The third refuge is refuge in the Sangha, and that means refuge in loving relationship, refuge in our experience of connectedness. When I wrote True Refuge, the book, I organized it. The architecture of the book is around these three pathways because they, in the last decade or so, have become so meaningful in my own path. When I started writing True Refuge, I was in a period of real sickness and in a way that I had no certainty as to being able to recover. So I was living in a really frightening place, a place filled with grieving. And the question that was so compelling to me was how, when we face the inevitable challenges and losses, how do we find a refuge within our own being of love, of awareness, that really allows us to find some peace and happiness? How, in the face of living and dying, do we find peace with ourselves? So this talk is really going to explore each of the refuges with that context because, you know, if you ask yourself the question, and this is something I ask myself a lot, you know, if I was at the end of my life, you know, in those moments, right at the end of my life, what would most matter? And what comes to me as well, it would matter to really sense that timeless awareness that's beyond this body that's changing and going. Just sensing something that's true, that I belong to, that's timeless, that awareness. And it would matter that I wasn't in trance, that I was really awake to this precious changing moments. That's the second refuge. And it would matter to feel love, to feel that sacredness of connection with other beings. That's the refuge in Sangha. And what I've become so clear to so many of us that are on this path and this practice is that what matters to us in the moments of right before we die is exactly what matters to us through our whole life. We don't have to wait. In fact, if we wait, we miss out. So that's kind of one of the invitations of our reflection tonight is don't wait. Take refuge. And when we say take refuge, we mean take refuge in what's really true and here. So as most of you know, when we're stressed, we are totally conditioned to take refuge in experiences that give us temporary relief or temporary gratification. And it's natural, and I call it false refuge, but it's not in a derogatory way. It's in a way just to get that it helps just for a little while. It doesn't really bring the happiness or peace that we're seeking. But I'll speak to it a little bit, just to sense, so you can just reflect and sense what are the false refuges that you get caught in, because as long as we're habituated in these ways, we can't turn towards the light, towards the diamond that's inside us. We tend to go through the day, as I mentioned, kind of busy and on our way somewhere. Lily Tomlin says, for fast-acting relief, try slowing down, So instead of this false refuge of speeding, slow down. So common ones. Okay, one false refuge is that we try to control others to get what we want. And we try to control them by judging or by demanding or expecting, by withholding our warmth or our appreciation. So there's different ways that what we're doing in some way is a manipulation to get others to cooperate. And I'll share with you my favorite illustration. Some of you will remember the mom that's preparing pancakes for her two sons, Kevin, age 5, Ryan, age 3. And the boys are arguing. So she says, she's an opportunity for a teaching. And she said, if Jesus were sitting here, he'd say, let my brother have the first pancake. And so Kevin turns to his younger brother and says, Ryan, you can have the first chance at being Jesus. Okay, so we manipulate. What other false refuges? Well, some of them are that we can try to control ourselves or deprive ourselves. I just got an email from one woman who's talking about anorexia and the ways that we're tight on ourselves and judging ourselves and trying to do more and be more. Another false refuge is the way that we chase after sensory pleasures, just wanting more of, whether it's food or whether it's possessions or whatever it is. A big false refuge is we take refuge in our mental control tower, in our fantasizing and planning and worrying, and leave our bodies behind. And we do that even in spiritual practice. We do a lot of thinking about the path rather than, let's just be here. And one example is of a monk, and yet one of the novices came up to him, to the senior monk, and said, "What happens after we die?" And the monk said, "I don't know." And this really upset the novice, and he said, "But wait a minute, you're supposed to be a Zen monk." And the response was, "I am a Zen monk, but not a dead one." You know? So we try to think our way into freedom. But a really big one for many of us, that'll be the last one I'm going to name right now, is this false refuge of always trying to do more, to prove ourselves. There's a sense of deficiency, that I'm not enough, and this ongoing kind of pressure to be better. And towards the end of a recent retreat I taught, a woman who was in her 70s said that she had spent her life striving with the sense of never enough, like always falling short. During the retreat, she touched some moments where her mind got really quiet, and then there was this sense, a wordless sense of enough. Just right now, it's enough. Everything's enough. There's nothing missing. And she had tears in her eyes when she shared with me this. She said really sadly, "Why did I have to wait so long to realize I didn't need to keep proving myself?" And I think you understand how many moments of life we sacrifice in some way in that false refuge of trying to get approval or proving, rather than living our moments. So in the moments that we're chasing after approval or whatever the false refuge is, are moments we're leaving home, and moments that we can't discover that diamond, that light, that warmth, that treasure inside us. Zen master Ryokan said, if you want to find the meaning, stop chasing after so many things, you know. The third refuge in Sangha, is refuge in loving relationship. And the outer ways of taking refuge are engaging in conscious relationship, whether it's with our friends, with our family, with our partners, and also in formal places, like we could be with 12-step groups. Our refuge in Sangha could be in the Buddhist communities. We have spiritual friends groups. They're called Kalyanamitta groups. We have in Washington probably 30-some of these groups where people meet once every other week, and they'll do a meditation and then really explore what's happening in our lives. And it's in that field of relationship that the magic happens. Because the gift of refuge in Sangha, in relationship, is we wake up out of that sense of an isolated, separate self and realize this field of presence that we belong to. So one of the big misunderstandings on the path is kind of that we're a self waking up, that we're doing it in our own little cave. And again, at this retreat that we just came from, I could see how we all arrived and we'd come from a little bit of a busy, frenzied world. We were a little bit more in that trance of a separate self trying to get somewhere. And so when we were sitting in the hall initially, there was more of that sense of tightness. There was more of that sense of just separation. And then by the end of the retreat, after a number of days of coming back home into the senses and being in, some small groups where we have very conscious kind of connecting and sharing of what's going on, the heart space, the feeling of the field was palpable. Refuge in loving relatedness means very consciously engaging with each other. Our brains evolve in our relationship with caregivers. We cannot become a mature person if there's not some field of relationship that's going on. We're influencing each other all the time. So to realize the truth of who we are means really to be engaged with each other. And the challenge is we're so conditioned to feel separate. And when we feel separate, we think something's wrong with us, and they go together. So one story to share with you, and this is about, I think, 3 years ago at a retreat. One friend from our community, our extended community, he's practicing, he's actually serving up at the Insight Meditation Society right now. We had a meeting, and he was very sunk in self-doubt and feeling very flawed and feeling very, very isolated. So I asked him, is there anything you like about yourself? I was going to go the metta approach, loving kindness approach. What can you appreciate about your goodness? And he said, well, at times I can be kind. So I wanted to get more in touch with it. I said, okay, an example. When were you kind recently? He said, well, actually yesterday, across the hall I saw this old woman sitting there on a chair, and her legs were dangling because she was too short to reach the ground. So I walked across the hall with my cushion, and I put my cushion under her feet. And it felt awkward. People were watching me, but I felt good about that. So I had him do what I often have people do, is get in touch with that good feeling and feel it and let it, and then get in touch with that sense of connection with this woman that you helped out, and really open to that, and he could do that, and he could feel in those moments he wasn't that small deficient self. He felt the truth of being in a field, being in that kind of sense of connectedness, and when he was in that, I asked the question, who are you, when you're in that field? And he could feel the freedom of that. That's the freedom of taking refuge in Sangha. So before we ended, before I said goodbye, I thanked him for his kindness to that old woman across the room. And I let him know that it was my mother, because it was. And of course, we both started crying because it was a very touching moment. But the connections are real. I mean, he wove a connection by reaching out. And we weave those connections, taking refuge in loving relatedness, whether we're reaching out and giving, or whether we're receiving, whether we're appreciating each other or receiving appreciation. There are so many ways that it happens. So that's the outer taking of refuge. And the inner is just as this man did when I said to him, okay, now just feel that, you offered the kindness, and just feel that sense of, that love, that presence that's here. The inner refuge is just opening to loving presence, just feeling it. We'll close with one of my favorite prayers. This is written by Diane Ackerman. In the name of daybreak, and the eyelids of morning, and the wayfaring moon, and the night when it departs, I swear I will not dishonor my soul with hatred, but offer myself humbly as a guardian of nature, as a healer of misery, as a messenger of wonder, as an architect of peace. In the name of the sun and its mirrors and the uttermost night and the crowning seasons of the firefly and the apple, I will honor all life wherever and in whatever form it may dwell, on earth my home and in the mansions of the stars. Namaste and blessings. Thank you.